I was last at Dixon's 2019, and then kind of a lot's happened since then. It was thanks to the folks for putting this on. Through all this, while I designed, this is a JP Beck rifle blended off of several originals. When I say it's blended off of several originals, no two are the same. There's lots of them out there. There's over 50 Schroyers that are out there by different hands within the shop, most likely, but everyone's a little different. So when I'm talking about a 1/16 of an inch here, an 1/8 of an inch there, even a 1/4 inch somewhere, what ultimately matters is that it looks pleasing to your eye and that it fits you. Because you lay several next to each other, they're all really different. The second part of this talk will be about taking your dimensions, your photographs, your tracing, if you've been lucky enough to take a tracing from an original, and putting it onto a piece of paper so that you can then lay that onto your expensive piece of maple, walnut, cherry, and not drill a hole in the wrong place. We'll all drill holes in the wrong places. That's how we fix them. So with that said, laying out a long rifle on paper can save us a lot of headaches. My first rifle was a kit from Track of the Wolf, and it never sees the light of day. And if I hadn't ruined the barrel, it would have become parts for something else. It just didn't fit me. The parts didn't go together the right way. There were holes that should have been drilled in one spot and instead were drilled in another. And kind of an expensive thing to just sit in a closet and not get used. So the next rifle that I built was from a blank, and I did everything. It was a stressful thing, learning how to inlet the barrel, drill the ramrod. I did all of that into a blank based off of a John Mall rifle that I'd seen in the case display at Dixon's. At the very top, I took a bunch of photos of it. I didn't have measurements, but I had some of the dimensions from rifles of colonial America, and there was a lot of fudge factor involved, but before diving into it, I laid it out on paper. It wasn't as complete looking as what I produce and sell, but it was enough to guide me to where I didn't make the same mistakes as I did on the first one, which was a pre-carved kit. There are a lot of things. For me, some of the mistakes I made were drilling holes in the wrong spot, as I said, and then the lock is in the wrong spot. And then it's interfering with the ramrod, and then the tang bolt doesn't fit with the trigger plate. So that's where all of this comes in. So looking at original guns, I found, with few exceptions, that most owners, whether it's a contemporary piece that just fits you really well, or an antique, most people are really willing to let you handle it, study it, at least take a few photos and measurements, and so that gets you leaps and bounds further than just a picture out of a book. So if you have the opportunity to see or handle a firearm, do so. And if you can, I never travel without this little tool. We can pass it around. I think the Recreating the American Long Rifles has a little diagram of how to make one of these. This and a roll of plain paper, doesn't have to be full length, just do about big enough to do the buttstock, and trace it. Pass that little thing around. It's just pretty simple, a little pointed piece of wood with a pencil that comes out right at the same point, so you trace the exact profile. And you want to mark the important things. Mark where the screws are for the trigger guard of the butt plate. Mark the termination of the butt plate heel. Mark where the lock is, even though you can't trace the lock. Mark where all the bolts go, where the pins are, where the breech is, all of these things, and take notes. Don't just take marks. Write down, this fits here. This is a little high. The wood has shrunk in this spot. Carving stops here. Write down what kind of carving it is. Is it raised? Is it incised? Is it a mix of both? And any other details that might make it easier for you to reproduce it later on. So along with that little tracer, I left it in my shop. I have a set of plastic non-marking calipers. So you can put it, you can touch a stock, I mean, you can touch a very expensive antique, and it's not going to hurt it one bit. So you can get fairly precise, for what we're doing here, fairly precise measurements of wrist height, wrist width, dimension at the tail of the lock. Actually, let me pull up, before we get into plans. I believe I have, let's see, there we go. Now I know there's a list that I think I've seen it on AmericanLongRifles.com of different dimensions you can take. Yeah, we're not going to deal with that. So these are kind of my go-to dimensions. That's probably that big to most of you, isn't it? If you want me to email this to you, take my card and I'll do that. I'm sorry I didn't make any printouts, but like I said, I think on AmericanLongRifles.com I've seen a similar cheat sheet with everything laid out, dimensions to take, and these are the big ones. You know, barrel length and breech dimension. That sets the overall thickness and size of the rifle. Caliber, it's going to affect the weight, length and height of the lock plate. You're going to try to find something close. You don't want to put a round-faced English lock on a, you never say never, never say always, but you probably don't want to put one of those on a Lehigh Valley rifle. And vice versa, you wouldn't put a hand-forged German lock on an English fowling piece. Other dimensions, length of the lock panel, so not just the lock plate, but how far does the wood extend ahead of and behind the lock? How far how does it taper into the wrist? So on some rifles it tapers quite drastically. If we're looking from above, like bird's eye view, looking down, lock panels going back, and then some rifles it tapers quite drastically and then flares back out to the butt plate, and other rifles, again, Lehigh Valley, I'm going to mention those because they're a favorite of mine and they have a really strange, unique architecture. They're very wide through the wrist and have a very unique wrist shape. So the other dimensions, length of pull, you're going to change that to fit you or whoever you're building it for. But having it there so you can figure out exactly where the trigger was on the original, it helps. What else is important? Drop at the heel in the comb. You can adjust that within limits. You don't want to give it so much drop that it acts like a lever and recoils up into your face. On the other hand, if it's too straight, you can't see the sights. This is where going by photos alone, it's a little bit of a gamble, because that was a gamble for me with my second rifle. It doesn't quite fit me. I made the stock a little too straight and it bites me right here. If I'd given it a smidge more drop and lowered the comb slightly, it would have fit me better. But I was going off of a photo and I didn't know how the original rifle actually shouldered. Turned out I got to handle that original rifle years later. It didn't shoulder all that well either, for me. Any other questions as I'm going along? So going back to the Beck rifle, I take dimensions with the calipers, there we are, and I take photographs. Now again, you gotta ask, because not everyone wants to have photographs taken. Sorry, wrong button. So these photographs I saved off of, I think it was Julia's auction site, maybe 5 or 6 years ago before they were bought out. And they had started doing this really neat thing where they took a series of photos as the rifle was being turned, which is perfect for building if you don't have the original rifle to study. So in this case, this Beck, this beautiful piece, wooden patch box, really hasn't been messed with. They gave a series of photos and I saved each one. And as you're taking photos of an original or a contemporary piece that fits you really well, do the same thing. Have someone rotate it and do just this. So look at how the light shines on the gloss, and you can start to see the flat spots. That section through the wrist there is pretty flat, reflecting the light as it transitions into the toe. And then look at right here. This was a big influence when I built one of my first specs. Look how flat that the cheek piece is, and how far down the wrist goes into it. So these are details that in a black and white photo in one of Shumway's books or Kindig, you're just not going to get. So that's the whole sequence, and they did that for a few of their rifles, and then nobody's done that since. And I wish they would, but that's how it is. But having a sequence of photos like that for you to return to after handling the gun, because having that sequence just makes it a lot easier when you're going to shape it. And for me, I take photos, I study, and then I put all the parts together, and then it's weeks later or months later before I start building the thing, and I've forgotten a lot of it. So having these to refer back to is huge. Let's see, covered all that. So just a few other things. Note the details on the furniture. File work, moldings, little things that dress a rifle up that the original maker did that usually aren't included in the castings that you're going to get. Same with the carving style, the engraved designs. Having those three-dimensional photographs to refer back to with the carving, it really helps to show the depth of the carving. Is it pretty deep? Is it very mottled? Or is it fairly flat on top? Or is the depth inverted? Is it sort of an incised or even chip carved style? So then going to, any questions about looking at an original? And I'm not sure, maybe I didn't need to bring this down after all. I guess not. So then the next step would be going off of dimensions in RCA or Kindig or photos in those books. And those are a really good start, but again, they're black and white. And in my experience, the dimensions are not the most accurate. I've seen some of them, and you know what is described as a 4.5-inch butt plate's actually 4 3/4. And if you try to take an image out of a book, you know, a page of a book that's this big, and scale it to full size, you're going to be misled by those dimensions. So you don't want to take the dimensions exactly as they're written. Kind of get an idea, get a ballpark, and then go from there. And I started with a Xerox machine at the library, taking Shumway's book and making lots of copies and blowing it up a little bit larger, a little bit smaller, piecing usually two or three pieces of paper together until I had the dimensions that either looked right if I wasn't building for me, or that were my dimensions. I know what's comfortable for my drop at the heel, drop at the nose, what's going to fit with my cheek. When I had built rifles on commission, I would try to take or have a customer take those dimensions as well. And what I would end up with were, pardon the term, but end up with these paper dolls. This is as close to full scale as I could make this attributed John Rupp rifle without ever handling it. Just sold at auction recently, and they provided outstanding photos. So I was able to make kind of a back and front and lay it out. This is visually one of my favorite rifles. I have no idea if it'll fit me, but it's one of the next ones I'd like to build. Those print-offs, I had to adjust a little bit. You can stretch it in the wrist, you can stretch it in the body of the gun, but you don't want to stretch it in one place at once, or condense it if you're shortening it. So I like a 13.5 to 13.75 trigger pull, but I don't want to take that if I'm going from a say a Jaeger rifle that's got a really short 12.5-inch trigger pull, and I want to extend it a little bit. I don't want to take that out just of the wrist or just of the comb, because then your dimensions are not your dimensions, your aesthetics are going to be thrown off a little bit. So you want to stretch it gradually so that you maintain the proportions that the original maker did. Does that make sense? I have, having drawn lots of these and studied a lot of them, I have dozens and dozens of paper dolls, and they live in a shop, or live in the shop. Yeah.
You're talking about your 13.5.
Yeah.
You figure that out by shooting different guns. Is there a amount of weight on
Yeah, so the question was, for my 13.5, 13.75 trigger pull that I prefer, did I figure that out by shooting versus measuring? So I tried going by measurements, and that suggested I should have a 14.1/8, give or take, trigger pull. And that first Jack the Wolf rifle kit I built to about that, no way, didn't fit. And at that point, shortening the stock was not going to work. So I learned that just by handling them, by going to the old Dixon show, Lewisburg show, asking nicely to pick up some of Allen's guns, Mark Whelan's guns, Kenya Hagen, Eric Hettenberg, picking up some of my favorites and seeing how it fit. And it turns out for me, a Beck rifle fits great. It's a really comfortable straight stock gun, but I like the curvature, the shape of a lot of the Lehighs, even though they don't fit me that great. I also don't shoot that much. Not enough to where it punishes me that much. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Any questions about blowing things up, printing? For these color photos taken from auction websites, again, I'm guessing a little bit as to how big to make them. I know that the barrel's not going to be any smaller, usually, any smaller than 15/16 across the breech. Maybe occasionally they'll get down to 7/8, but that's getting really small. And usually they're not going to be, for this style, any bigger than 1.1/16. So that's your range from a standard A weight to C weight barrel that you can get off the shelf. So shooting for 1 inch, give or take, and then you can go up or down from there, depending how it looks. Keep in mind the size of the ramrod. I think a lot of kits used to be supplied with a standard 3/8 inch ramrod. That takes up a lot of space, and usually you've got a pretty hefty web. When I'm designing a rifle, I try to shoot for about 5/30 seconds web, maybe no more than 3/16. And unless I'm building something with a really large bore, I'm going to make a 5/16 ramrod channel. And you look at a lot of originals, and the ramrod channel is that small, and they've got a 1/4 inch tapered ramrod by the time you get to the breech. Now it's going to flare out to 3/8 or 7/16 or larger at the muzzle. And so, if you're wanting to go by the originals, they've got these tapered ramrods, and they're really slim at the breech, and then they flare out. So those are little notes to take looking at the originals, not going by just what you can buy off the shelf, because they're almost all just straight 3/8 ramrods that you can buy in a bundle. So then ramrod dimension, just taking that 16th out of it gives you a little slimmer gun. You don't have to, but it's something I like to do. And then figure 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 of wood below that. But again, you look at originals and they're all over the place. And some of them that weren't used very much have worn through from basic handling, light handling, and others that were used a lot are still very intact because it was a thicker piece of wood or a harder piece of wood. It's all variation. I guess the reason I'm kind of bringing that up is there's no hard and fast rules. So I make the print, you can copy it exactly, but when all is said and done and you're laying it out on the stock, if the ramrod hole wandered a little bit or your barrel's inlet a little differently, it's not that big a deal. because in the big scheme of things, when you're holding up the whole gun, no one's going to know about it except you. So going off of images, important note. So I've got, this printout. I've got an image here, and then I blended them together. Every lens, with few exceptions, every lens is going to distort that image a little bit. So an image with a close-up of a patch box is going to get you a really good section from the buttstock to the wrist, but if the lock is involved at all, it's way distorted, it's way stretched out. You have this fisheye effect with the lens. So an image of just the buttstock, the wrist section is going to be good, the butt plate's going to be a little stretched, the lock's a little stretched. So with Rifles of Colonial America, I think it was figure D had, when I was starting out with this, before you could have these auction photos, that was the best general image to go off of if you were going to take something out of a book and try to scale it up. It had the least distortion. And then I'd take other images to get the better details off of it. In the case of the auction photos, some are better than others, and especially if you take photos with an iPhone, it looks pretty good. You get a lot of detail, but they're really distorted by the time you print them out. So keep that in mind as you're laying it out, as you're putting it on paper or putting it on your stock, that what you're seeing in the photo is not really exactly how the gun is, which is why ultimately it's better to handle the original, whether it's an antique or a contemporary. Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
When you talked about changing length of boot, is there a hard and fast rule that you follow on where to take some of the length out of or add?
Yeah. I will sometimes, so I'll tell you the kind of three places where I stretch it. I'll stretch it just at the tail of the lock, and you can. Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Oh yeah, sorry. The question was, if I'm taking a gun that's got, say, shorter length of pull than I want, and I want to stretch it, is there a particular spot or set of places that I take that dimension and lengthen it? And part of it depends on the gun. It depends if it's a straight stock gun, that's going to change things differently than if it's a really curved shape to the stock. You can lengthen the lock panel just a little bit. I mean, when we're talking 1/8 of an inch, but 1/8 of an inch here, 1/8 of an inch through the wrist, and then 1/8 of an inch towards the leading edge, I'd say, like right about here of the comb. You can lengthen it in those three places, add as much as 3/4 or 1/2 an inch, and visually your longer rifle will still look pretty spot on to the original. Now, if you have to stretch something from 12.5 inches to 14 inches, ultimately your dimension in the butt plate, this is going to be a skinnier rifle through the buttstock than if it was only adding 3/4 of it or 3/8 of an inch or 1/2 an inch. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
But the whole point is gradual. You don't want to just take it here and add 1/2 an inch.
Yeah.
Now, again, as I say that, I started out by saying never say never, never say always with originals, because you see some originals by really talented makers, and you think, why'd they do that? I mean, you see them in the books. You see really well-known makers, some Becks that some of them are just outstanding, and others you're thinking, he had kind of an off day, or his apprentice had an off day. So you've got flexibility. So allow yourself that flexibility. You don't have to follow it just right. So that went away. Let me put up the full-size Beck print again so I can refer to it. So there. I guess that's still a little small, but I can point out some of the details. So when any questions about taking dimensions from originals, laying it out, and so on that we talked about? So now on paper or on your stock blank, the first dimension you're going off of is your barrel dimension. So you don't have to draw the whole thing out. I draw out to the ramrod entry thimble, and that's sufficient. For this rifle, I started with a wide breech, so I drew the barrel out first, whether it's on paper or on your stock. And I'm using, for paper, I'm using a 0.3 millimeter pencil. It's a special clicky pencil. But you get really fine lines, and even for work on a stock, if you're working on a nice plain surface, 0.3 millimeters is a lot better than the 0.7 or 0.9 that you can get at Staples. Just as far as precision work goes. And you can plane, with a hand plane on your stock or bandsaw close to it, and then plane right down to that line. So the finer your lines on the stock or on paper, the finer, or I guess the more accurately you'll be able to follow them. So start with the barrel, then lay out that ramrod dimension. For big gun, 3/8 of an inch. For smaller gun, 5/16. And then figure that 1/8 of an inch below. So that's gonna, I guess, those dimensions on paper or on your stock will guide you the rest of the way as far as, does it look too big or too thick? Do you have too much wood on it at the end of the day? The next step is I'm going to lay out where the lock goes roughly, and if I've taken a tracing or if I have one of these paper printouts, paper printout can just go right on the stock, and I'm going to loosely trace it. Or on paper, I'm going to slide the paper cutout underneath, and then trace it and adjust it from there. So, putting the printout underneath my sheet, I can tilt it down, I can tilt it up, I can give it more length, greater length of pull, less. You can make it roughly fit you, but I'm not really making anything permanent yet. It's just to get you in the ballpark. I use a drafting table because both of my parents were architects and I got used to that. But you can do this on a kitchen table, and a simple square, at least one long straight edge, and a really inexpensive set of French curves, just clear plastic French curves, helps you tremendously, just laying it out smoothly. And this is more, you don't need that if you're just laying it out on a stock. This is if you wanted to take something and make a full plan that you can reproduce many times or reuse many times. Yeah, pretty basic tools to get started. So with a lock, the original Beck rifle, you could use anything from a small siler to a Golden Age to, any of those faceted Germanic style locks. But chances are they're not going to be the exact fit of what's on the original. So that's where that sort of fudge factor comes in, and it's okay. Unless you want to build your own lock, you don't have to. But you can file, and you can take any of these commercial parts and modify them. That was something as a beginner, and again, with that first kit, I didn't have a choice because everything was pre-inlet. But with that second rifle, just about nothing on it was standard as you bought it. The castings, the parts get you most of the way there, but there's nothing sacred about them. Change them up within reason. You don't have to, unless you're really making a fantasy gun. Don't stray too far from what the original guys did. But put the moldings in, put the bevels on, and change things up. You change the shape of the lock plate so that it fits visually with what the originals look like. Make them smaller, or I've even taken completed locks and heated up the tail or heated up the nose of the lock and stretched it out. Gradually, gingerly, you don't want to change the geometry, but you can do that and make a lock look more appropriate to the style of the rifle. And as far as on paper goes, the Track of the Wolf's paper catalogs have all those full-scale images of your parts. That's a good way to lay it out ahead of time before you order the parts or before you buy them, to make sure that they're all going to align properly. So your trigger trigger plate to lock and sear geometry is correct. And having those full-scale parts on your blank or on your piece of paper helps you then lay out where those bolts should go. So, I don't know, let's see, I guess lock bolts, the sort of golden rule is you don't want to notch the barrel and you don't want to intersect with the ramrod channel. I don't think, let's put it this way, more antiques that I've handled and been able to disassemble have had either notched barrel or a notched bolt because it intersected with the ramrod channel than haven't. So unless you've got a very substantial web and place that front lock bolt perfectly, you're going to hit something, and it's okay. I mean, there are several kits in production today that, to keep things looking right, have a little tiny notch in the breech of the barrel. It's not a big deal. It's not going to influence the strength or impact the strength of the barrel. As far as the rear lock bolt, this is something that it's hard to show even on the plan, but we think about, well, how many of you have built a rifle? Show of hands. All right. When you build it and you're drilling the lock bolts through the stock, are you freehanding or using a drill press with the little angle jig or little drilling jig? Freehand or drill press? Drill press. So drill press generally wants to set you up to drill a perfectly perpendicular hole. Most of the originals aren't. I mean, they're freehanding that for one thing. And there's different ways to do that. You can drill part way from both sides and hope that you meet in the middle and then ream that hole out. But having an angled lock bolt, I'm going to get up here and point a little bit. Got a cable. So up here, we've got the lock parallel to the barrel and the bolster set perfectly flat against it. But the lock bolt, if I were to go straight across, it's a little low in the lock plate. It would actually interfere with the mainspring wanting to come up at full cock. So to get around that and still keep this nice low lock plate, where you see the top line of the lock plate terminates halfway up, or a little more than halfway up, the side flat of the barrel. This is a really small visual thing that I think is very important and is often overlooked. If you can, and again, it varies on what type of gun you're building, but if you can lower this and have your top edge of the side panel be lower than or equal to that corner flat of the barrel, visually it makes for a very pleasing rifle. But to do that, you can't drill a perpendicular hole. You need to drill up towards the lock bolster a little bit. That is an added challenge. There's a drilling jig. You can sharpen a bolt, put it in the bottom of your drill press, and then line up your drill bit with the tip of that bolt, and then stick your rifle in between. So long as you know where you want the hole to come out and where you're starting, you can drill at any angle and come out within a 32nd of an inch or so. And then you can always file it until the bolt fits just right. And you can do that with the forward lock bolt too. I've angled them up to clear the ramrod channel and notch the barrel slightly, but for that correct visual look when looking at the original, whether they did that on purpose or not, or whether they just had an off day and drilled it crooked, they can't say. But when copying that original, I try to follow, whether it was a mistake or not, try to follow that same geometry. Any questions about that or layout of the lock bolts? Same with the tang bolt. You're going to position it so that the tang bolt is at the head, 90 degrees to whatever angle the tang is at. If you're coming, wake up. If you're coming in at a too steep or too shallow of an angle, it just makes it a lot harder to finish off that tang bolt and keep it in line as you're building the gun. Let's see, what's next? Web. Trigger location. Some people like a really soft, very light trigger pull. Other people want a very heavy trigger pull so they know exactly when that's going to click, and some people like it right in between. That's all, or you can change all of that by where you pin your trigger in relation to the sear. I try to go for about no closer than 7/16 of an inch from my pivot location of the trigger to where it engages the sear bar. You get much closer than that and you have a lot of creep. It'll be a very light trigger release. You won't quite know when it's going to fall, but it feels squishy to me, and that's just my personal preference. Other people would disagree. So I put mine a little further forward, and then you have to tune the lock, which is another seminar in itself, so that you have a nice crisp, light trigger release. That's my preference, but there's not a right and wrong answer to that, but it's something that you can change. And doing so will, of course, change the trigger pull length, so you have to factor that in as you're laying it out on your stock. But that's something you think about early on as you're laying out the gun. How far forward or back do I want the trigger, and how does that engage with the lock? I want to talk about angle of the lock, because I see this on a lot of kits, on a lot of contemporary builds, and then it's all over the place on originals. But the angle of the lock determines how the wrist is shaped, how it all flows together. And this is an aesthetics thing. This is there's not a hard, fast rule to it, but some original guns, say I'm going to pick on the Lehigh guns again, they're kind of odd. The lock is usually, the hand is usually on the upper third of the barrel flat, with the nose of the lock pointed down and the tail kicked up. And you think, well then, to make that wrist flow down, don't you want to lock with some curvature? But you don't. You do that, it doesn't look right. They have very straight, short locks. And what it means on a Lehigh gun at least is that the wrist actually dishes upwards. So actually I've got, excuse me, just to show that. Let's go back. Nope, maybe I can just, there, that'll work. I know it's kind of faint. Can you see that okay?
A little bit.
Or enough at least? So if we took a straight edge from the bottom of the lower forestock, when we reach here, if you laid a straight edge here, you'll have a gap right here. That's again, not hard, fast rule, but visually that gap allows you to have that slimmer wrist, and it's actually quite a straight stock. This is loosely based on the really famous Herman Rupp with the 48 or 49 inch barrel and the flames at the muzzle cap and all the wire inlay. But if you take a straight edge from the line of sight, you've actually not got a ton of drop. A lot of contemporary builders put more drop into the stock, more drop here, so that it doesn't bite you when you shoot it. That's okay, it still looks visually like a Lehigh gun. But if you lay them side by side, this is actually kind of a straight stock gun with a very high nose of the cone. So it's going to get you right there, unless you shoulder it with care. But that's where the lock is tipped forward, and the tail, even on a straight lock, so let's call that a large siler, that straightish lock is, the tail's tipped up, but the tail of the lock is still at center or a little below center of the wrist, which allows you to keep that nice kind of golden rule, if we'll go there. I'm not going to go there, but that aesthetically pleasing look where you have a little more on top, a little less on the bottom, or so on. And on a Lehigh gun, strange wrist shapes. We've got this kind of soft egg-shaped, diamond-shaped wrist with somewhat hard ridges at the top and the sides, and then a rounded bottom. And I draw extra sections because from a two-dimensional black and white photo, you just can't see that. You've really got to roll the rifle to get that feel. Back to the back. Any questions on a RUP or Lehigh gun? Back. So in this one, it's just the opposite. The lock is on the lower third of the barrel. And this is, I think when I drew this, I drew it envisioning a small siler, but, large siler, small siler, but the small siler just kind of matched with the original that I had measured. The wrist drops quite suddenly. You still don't have very much curvature in the lock. It's still a straight-ish lock. But you positioned it so the tail is just below center, and you've got this nice pleasing flow. So lock position, when you're laying it out on the stock, kind of dictates how the rest of it goes. And if your lock's too high, if you try to add too much drop, you're going to end up with a wrist where the tail of the lock is on the higher side of things, and it's just visually not going to flow right. I keep using the word visually and aesthetically pleasing. That's a completely subjective thing. I can't teach to you what's aesthetically pleasing. That's what you like, I might not like, and vice versa. But these are some general, I'd say, goals to strive for that will help you keep it looking good and within the realm of an original gun. Bone dimensions. Okay, so important point. The Beck rifle, very different from that Herman Rupp rifle. They're, except for being built in Pennsylvania, maple and iron parts, about as different as they get as far as the shape goes. If you're shopping for parts, I think this is obvious enough, but I'm going to say it. If you're shopping for parts and you want to build a Beck rifle, don't buy a Jacob Dickert trigger guard. Don't buy a Herman Rupp butt plate, and so on. You can absolutely take something that's close and then modify it. I've used a lot of castings and then, pounded them out, changed the shape, changed the comb so that it fits what the original gun looks like. But that goes, again, back to nothing is sacred. You mash it, you change it, you make it look right for the style of gun you're copying. So after you've laid out your profile, something you don't have to do, but I guess because the parts that you bought will kind of dictate the rest, but laying out the top view, at least on a blank, is helpful. Figuring out your line of sight versus your cast off. As a right-handed shooter, usually put about 1/8 of an inch off. That's, again, personal preference. There's no hard, fast rule. I've got an original brown bass musket that, for whatever reason, has about 3/8 of an inch cast off. Probably because the wood has changed in 250 years. But you see rifles that were very specifically built with cast on, cast off. There are European rifles that are for right-handed shooters who are left-eye dominant. And if you're looking from above, the stock goes, here's the rifle, it goes over and then back. Because for that wealthy client, it was easier to keep shooting right-handed but with their left eye than to switch the dominance of their eye or switch how you're handling the rifle. It's kind of a connect the dots thing because with your casting, hopefully you know the measurements of the butt plate, the width, height, and so on. You know how wide it's going to be. You've got the photos of the original, so you know how much or how thick the patch box should be. In my experience, most reproduction patch boxes are way too thick. They're as far as wooden patch box goes, just because it's what's drawn there, they're very slim. They're usually this very small protrusion from the stock. And brass patch boxes are usually a lot thinner than what's available today as well. And usually the inside is covered in hammer marks. So, allow yourself that freedom and flexibility. So for sections, I draw them on because it's really helpful for me when I go to shape the stock. It's kind of the hardest thing to get from a two-dimensional photo. I'd almost say you can't. The Kentucky Rifle Foundation has a bunch of CDs, I don't know how many there are now, that have outstanding color photos of original guns. The CDs are 20 bucks? 25? 20, thank you. And what's that? There's thumb drives now, that's right. And they are worth every penny and more. For the quality of the photographs, the ability to zoom in on a little detail that you're probably going to overlook if you even have the gun in front of you, unless you have hours to do so. They're probably, after the books, I'd actually say even before the books, they're the single biggest help when building a new rifle. Because you get these detail shots that black and white photos just don't have. And then some of the more recent books with color photos, and my favorite are angled or skewed photos, where it's not just flat on or from the top down, where you're getting the rifle and you're looking at it with that point of view or that point of view, because that's going to give you your wrist shape, your shape of the comb. It's going to give you the shape of the forestock. A forestock is not just a little U shape underneath the barrel. It varies tremendously on a, I'm going to say a typical, but on a typical Lehigh gun, it's kind of a soft wedge shape. When I had the opportunity to handle the 2 Kuntz rifles in the Metropolitan Museum, I was expecting, okay, soft, round shape. It was truly like a soft V in the lower forestock that then flattened out rather drastically into the lock panels because it had to. You can't continue that V shape with a trigger guard. And then a different rifle, or this 18th century English Belgian musket, has a very rounded profile, but everyone's different. I've not used one, but there are non-marking profile gauges. They have little plastic pins within, kind of sandwiched between a plastic frame. And the idea being that, you could take it up to a complicated shape and do this and get that profile and then loosely trace it. I've not used one on an antique. I haven't asked someone if I could. I'm always wanting to be very careful and aware of the value of an antique and what that means to the person who owns it, and not wanting to put a single scratch more into it than what it's already accumulated over the last 200 years. That is something I'd like to try. I haven't bought one. They're not all that expensive. That might be a really good way to get an accurate wrist shape or lower forestock shape or cheek profile. If we're talking about this section, how flat is it? How hollowed out is it? The moldings you don't need to get in a contour gauge. You can get that through photographs or just you'll see that shading. But it's the subtle profiles that you can't get through those photographs. Does anyone have one of those? You do. Do you like it?
I don't use the plastic one. I use the metal one.
Yeah.
To build it.
Right.
I never put the metal one on.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
I use it to check on your drawings.
Yeah.
To check my progress side to side as I'm going.
Right.
They're really handy.
Yeah.
Another place I use it for is when I'm bending my tank.
Right.
You can use it to get that perfect bend on the tank.
Yep. Yep.
So,
yeah, get it close and then you can file it to finish.
Right.
Yeah, I have a metal one that I've used on just that, shaping a stock.
I haven't seen the plastic ones though. I don't think they would be as accurate because the fingers are much wider.
They are thicker.
They're thicker. So
they're not going to be as accurate as those fine metal ones. But they'll still be able to tell you, a rough shape. And ultimately, you'll lay it out on your stock or a piece of wood, and you're going to connect the dots anyway. That might be a good option. but you have to try that for yourself. I can't condone that yet. I guess coming back to what I said early on, unless you've got that original rifle on the bench right in front of you, you're not going to be able to make a perfect copy of it. I've done 2 bench copies. They were the hardest guns I've ever built, not because they were complicated or had lots of detail, but because I actually had the gun right there, so I could say, no, I'm not quite there yet, or oops, I took a little too much off, can't put that back, and then have to blend it. But having the bench, or having an original on the bench, I found more challenging, or less forgiving, I guess I'd say, than having just photographs and measurements, because ultimately it's built to fit you. It's built to fit how you want to shoot. It's your gun. Don't build an exact copy of something if it's not exactly what you want. If you're putting hundreds of hours into it, it should be yours. Yeah, I think, so you have to, the last time I gave this seminar was in the basement of Dixon's barn. So we had about 40 minutes and 20 minutes of Q&A. So I'm about there. We've got time if you have questions. I'm happy to talk about anything you're interested in. Yeah, Rich.
So when you're using the tracing tool, one of the challenges is the area underneath the trigger guard.
Yes.
And that transition from forestock to where the trigger is to the ball.
Absolutely.
And I don't know, I find that an area that's challenging to figure out exactly where the curvature of the stock begins
Yeah.
in relationship to the trigger.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the most architecturally important areas of the gun.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that. And it's one of those parts where you don't get it quite right, it kind of throws off the rest of it. If you didn't hear, Rich was saying that getting the, hang on, wake up. Getting this section from here, about through here, Rich?
Yeah.
Getting that section right with the curvature, with the shaping up to the lock and into the wrist, as well as the head of the lock. But in profile, when do you stop that straight line, and when do you start curving down? That is really important. And it varies significantly from gun to gun. On this Beck, it threw me off when looking at the original, because it kind of starts right here. It starts right at the back of the trigger guard, and the trigger plate and the trigger are built into that slope. The wrist drops off quite substantially right at the start. There are other guns, and I think that's kind of a Beck and Bayer thing. On some of the later Dicker guns, it continues back a little ways further and then drops. And let's imagine if we stretch this here, stretch this back another half an inch or inch, and then start our drop, well, that changes everything with the geometry, with the nose of the comb, with the butt plate. It kind of changes all of that. So when you have your paper pattern or your photograph, don't forget to look at the big picture, no pun intended, the whole gun, and make sure it still looks right when you've made those edits. But Rich is absolutely right. The hardest part, beyond just that profile line, is, and this is where taking notes comes in, or those three-dimensional photos, that spinning of the back I showed earlier, or your own photos if you can take them, showing this area from a skewed standpoint. That's the best way to get a sense for how the wrist should shape, how that transition should be. And same for up here, where you're transitioning from a three-dimensional round section to flat, and then your inlet trigger guard. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Measurements and this part of this.
Yeah.
Yada.
Yeah.
Because it'll make it look better. So if you actually use that, just take a look, right?
Originally, they just made them fit the customer that came in. You know, you could buy, this was something that there are historians that know the birth and death and marriage of every gun maker in the 18th century, early 19th century. I'm not one of those guys. I'm the hands, and many of them work with their hands and build beautiful guns. My brain doesn't work that way. I'm all about details. I can see a detail on a rifle across the room and say, oh, that's this maker. That's how my brain works. But something I learned, one of the things I took home from Williamsburg, my experience 3.5 years in the Williamsburg gun shop, was kind of, truly being immersed in an 18th century shop and using those tools and going by historical records, because as a museum, you had access to all of these, hundreds of thousands of historical documents that show what things cost, how brass parts for a rifle or a fowling piece coming from England were sometimes purchased by the pound, or the weight of the brass. Materials were the expensive part of the product, not the labor. Today it's the opposite. I guess all that is to say, back in the day, and except for military contract guns and I'd say trade contract guns, there was no pattern that every gunsmith was following. Now, they had their own patterns for castings. If they weren't purchasing their castings from someone else or buying their lock at a hardware store the way you could post-Revolutionary War, you had to make that yourself or know someone who did, and those people made their own patterns for a butt plate, for a trigger guard. And those apprentices, or an apprentice of that gunsmith, was likely going to make hardware in the same style. When we look at a Bayer rifle compared to a Beck rifle, Bayer being an apprentice, the hardware is virtually identical. You see Northern Virginia, what town? Of course, I lived there for 3.5 years now. I can't remember the towns. In any case, Shenandoah Valley, early Sheets rifles have a trigger guard that you lay them side by side, and you're like, oh, that's a Beck trigger guard and a Beck butt plate. There's a connection there. As not the historian, I can't tell you exactly what that connection was. I think Wallace Kessler had written about that at some point. But again, no set pattern that we're aware of. I would love to see a piece of paper show up with a plan. I don't think it ever existed. They had a style. They learned that style, and with some exceptions, that style didn't evolve that much over the years. You look at early Jacob Kuntz work, trained Lehigh Valley area, and his rifles are very classic Lehigh Valley. As soon as he moves to Philadelphia, that all changes. They get even fancier than they had been. The architecture changes. He loses the step in the wrist. The barrels get heavier. The bores get smaller, and that's the evolution within his gun making career. And you do see that, I would say, with just about everyone's career. But some people found a style they liked and stuck with it, or that's what their customers came to expect. Which is why you go across the mountain range to the next valley over, and their guns were completely different. Because it's a long way out and back. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up? All right, well, thank you very much for sitting through this. I hope this made sense. Again, first time I've been up in front of a crowd in a little while. If you do have questions, come by my booth. If you want to buy a print, they're on regular 20-pound paper. You make as many copies for personal use in your shop as you like. Feel free to edit them, make changes to fit you. I just discovered my printer suggested to try this new plastic, and we did a sample of a print printed on PVC plastic. You can still roll it up, but it's a lot more durable. It does cost more. I'd have to charge more, but if it's of enough interest, I'll probably produce limited sets on this hard plastic, and it wears like nothing else. It's great. But yeah, if you have other questions and show's over, feel free to email me. I have a card on the table. My website has some tutorials on it. I'm always adding to it. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of the day and hope you don't get too heavily rained on. But it wouldn't be just if you forgot it.